Welcome to the Week 2 Forum. This week we are exploring the moment of federalism's creation, which was the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The founding generation had thrown off the shackles of what they perceived to be a foreign government, but they also experienced the problems associated with an ineffective government under the Articles of Confederation. Certain states were getting by, but many of the states that had borne much of the financial brunt of the Revolutionary War confronted serious fiscal crises, and the inability of the Articles of Confederation to coordinate national policy effectively worsened those problems. As you read this material, I think it's important to recognize that the delegates that attended the Constitutional Convention did not consider themselves Americans. They were Virginians, New Yorkers, Marylanders. Additionally, the delegates from the larger states had very different notions of sovereignty than did delegates from the smaller states. And the slaveholding states were determined that the institution of slavery would not even be considered at the Constitution, except on terms advantageous to their state's interests and the landholders of those states. On a number of issues, slavery and the role of tariff policies in regulating international trade being prominent, no easy basis for compromise existed. As I mentioned in the overview, the convention delegates confronted some tough choices and agreed to compromises that probably violated their own personal belief systems. To me, what distinguishes the politics of that founding generation from today's politicians, who so often, that's the defining characteristic, right? So often today, our politicians mistake ideology for principle. And betray a truculence and unwillingness to compromise that leads to gridlock and ineffective government. That's, again, the difference between effective and ineffective politics. As I mentioned in the Week 2 overview, many of the fiercest debates at the Constitutional Convention centered on the idea of sovereignty and where sovereignty should probably be located. And that boiled down to a question of how powerful should the national or federal government be? Advocates of broad nationalism believed that the federal government needed to have considerable authority and latitude to govern effectively, while advocates of narrow nationalism wanted the states to retain a considerable check on national power so the larger states would not be able to use the national government to impose their will on the smaller states. Part of the genius of American federalism is this kick the can down the road, nature of several of the compromises made during the convention. The framers, as I mentioned elsewhere, recognized the need to avoid trying to settle many issues that would have been deal breakers on things like state sovereignty or slavery or tariffs. And so they deferred action on any kind of final settlement. One of the reasons why Robertson cites Woodrow Wilson's argument that each generation has to decide for itself what federalism means is that perceived need to allow certain kinds of national problems to marinate for a time and to see if the state governments could identify a best path forward. That's one of the reasons why American federalism is distinctly American. How many other countries could tolerate such uncertainty? So as you read the material, consider participating in the forum. Think about some of the questions that come out from the PowerPoint and from the study guide on the Week 2 resources link. For example, what does Robertson mean when he describes federalism as a double battleground? The late Aaron Wildofsky commented that federalism is all about inequality. What are the consequences of the Constitution's fragmentation of political authority? To what extent is that simply kind of freezing a status quo in place that may not be equitable? One of the essential requirements for a compound republic to govern effectively is that political factions have to work within the system in good faith. How has the hyperpartisan nature of American politics frayed that sense of mutual extension of goodwill towards other Americans? What are the consequences of one side demonstrating a willingness to stymie the system? Can a federal system survive if one party refuses to join in the consensus that some government is necessary? I'm just throwing out some of these questions that we need to consider over the course of the semester. There's no need for a definitive answer this week. Remember, engagement is an important part of these forums. If you're not taking the material seriously and thinking carefully about the readings, we probably won't have a very fruitful discussion. As always, if there's anything in this week's reading that you don't understand, the forums are a perfect place to ask a question. So let's have a great discussion this week.